They crossed Jamaica faster than expected. Pintel only allowed their party the briefest of stops on their trek through the jungle, even after their lantern burned out, and by sunset the following evening they found themselves on the sands of the island's northern coast. They found Port Antonio on the night after that, and Ocho Rios late the next evening. The Black Pearl was at neither port. The only information Pintel or Ragetti could gather was from a serving wench in Ocho Rios, who claimed to have spoken with Jack Sparrow mere days before their arrival. According to her, the Pearl's eccentric new captain had bragged about knowing the course to a mysterious island in the northeast that was said to be bursting with treasure, and that he'd promised to bring her a string of pearls from said island upon his next visit to her tavern as proof that he wasn't daft. If there was any truth in the plans he'd divulged to her, then he and his black-sailed ship were currently on the way to that fanciful-sounding location. He was going to Isla de Muerta to claim the riches hoarded there. The riches that Pintel, Ragetti, and the rest of Barbossa's crew had spent 10 years stealing and collecting and hoping to spend someday when their curse was lifted. It had all been for nothing, thanks to Sparrow once again. Pintel and Ragetti spoke very little to each other in the days after their visit to Kingston. They said nothing of Edith. What was there to discuss? How destitute she must have become? Which horrendous disease from her clients had most likely claimed her life? Which settlement the two of them had been off terrorizing while she'd been breathing her last breath? Pintel only tried to breach the subject once. A while after their talk with the serving wench, when enough time had passed for that dreariness to leave their thoughts, he dared to ask if Ragetti was all right. Not about what, just if he was all right. "Why wouldn't I be?" was the other's response. He kept his gaze locked sullenly on his rum as he said it. They found another crew to set sail with from Ocho Rios. It didn't matter what the ship or her captain were named. They eventually found their way back to Tortuga, and there they stayed, fruitlessly awaiting the Black Pearl's return until all the coins they'd made from their rum sale finally ran out. They had no choice but to join the crew of another unmemorable ship after that. If he'd heard about Sparrow's plans before Kingston, Pintel might have tried to commandeer a ship. He would have tried to pursue that mincing, gold-toothed eel of a man and take back those riches. He would have gotten angry enough to concoct all sorts of ideas, and in the end, he and Ragetti would have made off with at least some of that treasure. But that was before Kingston. Now, he couldn't seem to get angry enough to do any of those things. He kept an ear out for word of the Pearl nonetheless. Every so often he'd hear a whisper or rumor of the infamous ship being spotted somewhere in the Caribbean, and his response would always be to gather Ragetti, Poochie, and their things, and join a new crew that was headed in that direction. What else was there to do? They needed something to work towards besides getting through their daily routines at sea, and since they were in no state to think of any new life goals, they may as well stick to their original plan in the meantime. And if it ever paid off, if they ever found the closest thing they had left to a home anymore, maybe then they'd be able to think of their next move. That was what Pintel told himself for the next several months. He lost count of how many ships they served on in that time. Probably too many, and they weren't all pirate vessels. If rumors of the Pearl took him and Ragetti to honest ports, then that was where they went. It was always a bit harrowing to join those crews, especially whenever the duo found themselves serving with crew members from previous merchant voyages. Luckily, a former businessman like Pintel was good at recognizing faces. He knew when to use a new alias, when to reuse an old one, and when to suddenly recall a prior engagement that prevented him and his friend from joining a crew after all. Secret identities aside, life aboard a merchant ship actually wasn't so different from a pirate's life. It was blander and more rigid, to be sure, as was most of the company, but it couldn't hold a flame to the strictness of a naval vessel. The ships were the same, though, and they required all the same maintenance that he knew how to administer. Sailing them also required the same cooperation among their crewmen, who ate, slept, worked, and lived on top of each other at nearly all times. And of course, there was a steady supply of inebriating beverages kept just for the crew's consumption down in the holds of those ships. It was manageable. Livable. maybe even oddly comfortable at times. Pintel could have almost seen himself happily taking to that life years ago if the Navy had never sunk its grappling hooks into him. He fantasized more than once about it in those months searching for the pearl. Every time, though, that fantasy turned to a lump in his throat the second he looked up from his swabbing and spied a stone-faced Ragetti overhead in the rigging. It wasn't hard to picture the lad's father doing that same sort of work for all those years that he'd spent away from his struggling family. Did Ragetti think about his father too when they were aboard those merchant ships? Was that why he kept growing more quiet, distant, and grim the longer their search dragged on? Just find the pearl, Pintel told himself repeatedly. If he's still going along with this, he still wants to find her too. Just keep it together till she turns up again. Sparrow can't stay under the surface forever. The old schemer followed that advice and kept his head on straight throughout those months. He kept his emotions in check, his patience intact, his stories straight, and most importantly, his wits about him. And then one day, it finally paid off. He and Ragetti were fishing on a dock in Nassau, an honest port in the Bahamas, when they overheard the news. Some captain was chatting up the harbor master on the next dock over, and he mentioned passing an island by the name of Pelegosto not 2 days ago. The island apparently sat 200 miles southeast of Nassau, just below the Florida Straits, and the only sign of humanity that the passing captain had glimpsed on its shores had been a run-aground ship lying beached on the sand at low tide. A ship with black sails. Pintel signed himself and Ragetti onto the first vessel he found that was bound for the Straits, some schooner called the Canterbury Trader. She had those miserable East India Trading Company colors flying from her mainmast, but he didn't care. It was worth the risk. The Black Pearl had returned to the Caribbean. She was maybe a 2-day journey away, and by the sound of things, Sparrow and his crew weren't even on board. Any man with the know-how could likely just row right up to her and take her, and a pair of such men could likely pull it off in half the time. Pintel was beaming at that notion the following afternoon. He was at sea on the deck of the Canterbury Trader by then, probably halfway to the Straits already, and it was taking everything for him to keep his grip on the mop that he was dragging back and forth over the deck planks. He couldn't help it. He was excited. And truth be told, he was nervous off his rocker at the thought of being so close to his goal. The mop handle slipped from his fingers at the next pull and clattered loudly at his feet. He made an exaggerated cringe at the sound and bent over with a laugh to retrieve it. The deckhand across from him was waiting with a skeptical stare when Pintel stood up again. "You sure you haven't already had your rum ration for the day, Smithy?" the black-haired youth asked. Pintel was Smithy. Jim Smith. He'd given up on clever fake names a long time ago. "Lad," he chuckled, "I found something more dizzying than a whole keg of rum to get me through today."
"What's that?"
The elder hesitated, then grinned again.
"Waking up from a nightmare." "Had cheese before bed last night, did you?" the other deckhand guessed without a hint of humor.
Pintel rolled his eyes and glanced at the captain's cabin below the quarterdeck. His latest commander, Higgins, had disappeared through those double doors with the navigation charts 20 minutes ago. There was nothing suspicious about that, but after all the captains Pintel had sailed under in probably the past year, he found himself growing rather curious about the rank and its many perceived perks. Blimey, he thought as he spied a hint of movement through one cabin window. Barbossa's old cabin on the Pearl's probably up for grabs right now. And I'll wager I've sailed more voyages and outsmarted more enemies than all these trading company dandies put together. A loud splash of water and several frantic voices erupted from the Canterbury's port rail just then. Pintel was by the starboard rail with the base of the mainmast blocking most of his view. Before he could peer around it, something slammed against its other side with a thud that shook the whole deck. "Call me a mutt again!" a ragged voice bellowed from behind the mast. "Call me a mutt again!" Pintel didn't recognize the voice at first. Then he heard barking and saw Poochie bouncing anxiously in place just off to his left. The dog was a step away from the mast on its port side, like he wasn't the least bit afraid of the shouter. The pirate dropped his mop and hurried around to see the commotion. There was the empty swab bucket lying on its side on the deck with all the mops. There was the petrified, soaking wet sailor with his back against the mast. and there was Ragetti, pinning him in place with a look of pure, seething hatred, while everyone else tried to pull them apart.
"Rat Jonesy!"
Pintel exclaimed, remembering his comrade's alias. He shoved through the useless mob and forced his thick arms in between the two men.
"What the blazes are you doing?"
Ragetti instantly backed off, but kept his scowl on his opponent. "That little ferret-faced bilge-rat's been calling me names since the minute we stepped on board. Says I look like some stupid dog with two different color eyes he saw once." He lurched towards the other man a second time. "How about I shows you how me eye got this way?" Pintel threw up his arms again.
"Get a hold of yourself, mate!"
"Sailors!" A clearer but firmer voice sounded over the ruckus. The crew fell silent and turned. It was Captain Higgins. The maroon-coated figure strode forward, navigation chart still in his hand, and paused in front of Ragetti like a cobra waiting to strike. A few men attempted to explain what they'd seen, but Higgins had clearly heard enough. He crossed his arms over his chest like a disappointed schoolmaster and didn't speak until Ragetti hung his head in shame. "A talking a crewmate, Mr. Jones. That calls for 10 lashes, if I'm not mistaken." Pintel stepped in front of Ragetti with a desperate smile.
No need for that, Captain. You're going to get blood all over this deck that your men just got done mopping. Let me straighten the kid out. I've sailed with him before, and I knows how to talk sense into him."
"Oh, there's no denying you do," Higgins said drolly with another glance around at the scene. He sighed after a moment. "Fine. Handle it this time. But if he does anything like this again, it'll be on both your backs." Pintel was already nudging Ragetti towards the stairwell that led below deck.
"Soundly noted, sir. And you."
He pointed at the sailor who'd been pinned against the mainmast.
"You gonna call anyone a mutt again?"
The dripping deckhand shook his head feebly. "No, Mr. Smith."
"Smart lad,"
Pintel deadpanned.
"You'll go places." "What the blazes is wrong with you?"
Ragetti wrenched his arms away as his rescuer herded him down the stairs. "I already told you what happened. I ain't no mangy, flea-bitten, tail-chasing mongrel." Pintel jabbed his finger ahead when they reached the last step.
"Sit down!"
They were in the crew's quarters, a spacious but dimly lit chamber that doubled as a sleeping barracks and mess hall. The pair trudged past the rows of hanging hammocks, causing a few of them to swing as they sped by, and came to a stop at one of the long dining tables at the room's far end. Pintel barely refrained from pushing Ragetti onto the nearest bench before he took his own seat on the other side of the table.
"Now you listen to me,"
he whispered sharply with one eye on the stairwell.
"We needs to keep a low profile round here. Any reason we gives this lot to think we ain't on the up and up with 'em could end with the two of us swinging from a scaffold in matching gibbets."
Ragetti flinched at the thought. He still had his head down, and Pinto could see his thin arms trembling in spite of the scowl on his face. The older pirate leaned closer and eased his tone just a hair.
"All's we got left to wait is one more day. Just one. And then we'll be close enough to that Pelegosto Island to jump ship. We could be home by this time tomorrow."
Ragetti looked at him then, but not in a way Pintel liked. He seemed taken aback by his mentor's words, almost offended even. Then a glint of understanding darkened his blue eye. His face suddenly warped with disgust. "'Cept we wouldn't be, would we?" the lad sneered. Pintel blinked at him, lost for words. Ragetti leaned back with his arms crossed over his chest like a petulant parody of Higgins. "I took us home," he declared. "It ain't there no more. That's the end of that. What you want to find is a giant boat, so's we can keep running from port to port, running in circles, running away, wherever you decides we wants to go. And what if that boat ain't on that island when we gets there? She's got a habit of not being where she's said to be. Where you gonna run to then, Captain Smithy?" Pintel leaned in with a sneer of his own.
"You know, you've gotten a right smart mouth on you since Port Royal, and I've had it up to here with it."
"Oh, I'm terribly sorry about that, Uncle Abner," Ragetti shot back. "What kind of mouth would you rather I had on me? The kind what says lots of right and smart things like,
'Once we're quit of the curse, we'll be rich men'?"
Pintel didn't remember leaping up. He just felt a searing pulse of anger and vaguely heard the shuffle of his bench behind him. The next thing he knew, he was on his feet with his fist cocked. Ragetti stiffened with his hands gripping his bench. His eyes bulged with fright, but he was only half looking at Pintel. The rest of his gaze was seeing something else. And once again, Pintel was seeing it too. Port Royal. That was where it had happened. Port Royal's prison on the night after their arrest. The night when the Navy had first marched them and their newly mortal pirate crew down into the belly of that fort. Ragetti had been next to him, clinging to Pintel's coat sleeve even as those shackles weighed down his bony wrists. The poor lad had stayed that way right up until their red-coated captors had led them around that last hallway corner and into the cell block. Pintel could only imagine what had gone through Ragetti's head at the sight of those jail cells. Memories of their time in the service? Thoughts of their looming execution? Or had it just been some beastly, instinctive fear of being caged? Whatever it had been enough to make the kid fight back. Pintel remembered all of it. Ragetti kicking and snarling, him yelling at his young friend to stop, the redcoats dragging them apart, and then Ragetti slipping through their grasp and dropping onto the stone floor to try and crawl away, only for them to lay into him with the butts of their muskets. Pintel had begged for them to stop. Those screams, those wails of pain, he hadn't been able to bear them. The soldiers hadn't stopped, though, until they'd satisfied their grudges, and every scream that they'd drawn from his boy in the meantime had been like a blow to Pintel's gut. Each one had reminded him of all the times when he'd hurt Ragetti himself, slapped him, punched him, damn near throttled him. All the times during their curse when he'd lashed out at that dog-like runt instead of at the people who'd really ruined his life. Edith would have despised him if she'd ever seen any of it. Below deck on the Canterbury, Pintel felt his anger melting away. He lowered his fist and leaned back unsteadily. As soon as he did that, he saw the fright start to fade from Ragetti's eye. Then he heard Ragetti's bench topple over as his shipmate sprang to his feet. Pintel jumped at the loud crash. The younger man leaned closer, towering over him. Ragetti had a naturally gentle face, but his features were lean, and he could make them look frightening in their own way when he clenched them together. He was doing that now, and just for a second, Pintel felt the effect of it, until he looked into that blue eye again and saw how misty it was. Pintel's remorse must have shown on his own face, because Ragetti turned just then and stormed away.
"Where you going?"
Pintel called after him weakly. "Where I wants to go!" Ragetti barked without looking back. Pintel watched him stomp up the stairs and vanish above deck. Poochie was standing by the top of the stairwell now, peering down quietly at the bald pirate with his tail between his legs. The dog was afraid to come closer. Pintel returned to his bench and heavily took a seat. He stared at his hands in his lap for a long time, too haunted to move them. His fault. It had all been his fault. He stared at those hands for as long as he could. Then he doubled over and buried his face in them when the full weight of everything and everyone he'd lost came crashing down on him.